I remember the smell first. Not the argument, not the motel room, not even my son's voice. Bleach and that stale, recycled air that comes from an overworked wall unit. That was what greeted me when I opened the door with the plastic key card and stepped inside. The room was narrow, a bed pushed against one wall with a brown coverlet pulled tight, a lamp with a crooked shade leaning slightly to the left, one framed print of a sailboat that had faded so much the water looked grey instead of blue. The kind of room meant for passing through, not for staying, and certainly not for being placed there by your own child while strangers carried boxes through your house. At the time, I stood there with my purse still on my shoulder and my coat still buttoned, and I remember thinking something small and oddly practical. He didn't even leave me a decent blanket. That's how my mind works when something is too large to face all at once. It searches for corners, for details, for one manageable observation that doesn't require immediate emotion. The motel sat just off Route 41 outside Indianapolis, tucked behind a gas station and a Wendy's with a broken red sign. It was late March, cold enough that the wind still carried the last edge of winter. I had on my navy cardigan and the low black walking shoes I used for errands and doctor appointments. I had packed a small overnight suitcase, 2 nights' worth of things, because that was what my son Eric told me this would be. Just while the contractors finish the flooring, he said. That was the phrase he used. Contractors, flooring, just 2 nights. He said it while standing in my front hallway with a clipboard in his hand, as if he were already managing something official. I had lived in that house for 28 years. My husband and I bought it when the paint was peeling and the back fence leaned so far to one side that the first storm nearly finished it off. We repaired things slowly over the years. First the kitchen, then the roof, then the upstairs windows, one by one, when the budget allowed. After my husband passed away, I stayed. I kept the yard trimmed, paid the property taxes, learned which faucet needed a careful turn, and which floorboard near the linen closet still made a soft click every morning. Then one Tuesday, Eric stood in that same hallway and told me the house wasn't safe during renovations. He said it gently. That's important. People imagine betrayal always arrives in raised voices, in slammed doors, in obvious anger. Sometimes it arrives in a careful tone, with one hand lifted slightly in a gesture meant to look helpful. I already handled everything, Mum, he said. You don't need to worry about a thing. Some people mistake silence for permission. I didn't say that out loud then. I only thought it quietly, almost in passing, while he reached past me, opened the hall closet, and pulled out my small suitcase before I had actually agreed to go anywhere. Later I realized that moment mattered more than I understood. There had been signs before that, small things. A stack of contractor flyers on the kitchen counter that I hadn't asked for. A call from a cabinet company that sounded strangely confident work was already scheduled. Eric mentioning resale value during a conversation where no one had brought up selling. At the time, I let each one pass, because they didn't seem connected. Or perhaps I simply didn't want them to be. Eric was 41 and worked in regional property management. That meant he had the kind of professional tone that can make almost anything sound reasonable if you don't examine it too closely. He wasn't loud. He wasn't reckless. In some ways, that made things harder. Reckless people reveal themselves quickly. Organized people can rearrange a situation for quite a while before anyone realizes something has shifted. When he drove me to the motel, he kept one hand on the wheel and the other moving gently as he explained things. It's temporary. The crew needs access. This actually protects the property. That last phrase stayed with me. Protects the property. Not protects you, Mum. Not keeps you comfortable. Protects the property. I watched the side of his face while he spoke. Same jawline he had at 16. Same crease near his left temple when he believed he was being patient. We stopped at a red light near Harding Street. I remember the dashboard clock showing 4:12, though I might be off by a minute or two. The heater was blowing too warm air into the car. My overnight bag rested between my feet. I asked him one simple question. Why didn't you tell me before today? He paused for a second. Just long enough to register. I didn't want to stress you out. That was when the car went quiet. There are answers that explain something, and answers that quietly close a door. That one closed a door, because if he had told me earlier, I might have asked to see the contract. I might have called the insurance company myself. I might have asked why moving bins and furniture pads were already stacked in my driveway before I had even agreed to leave. Instead, he waited until workers were present and the decision already looked settled. Procedure by momentum. That was his method. When we reached the motel, he carried my bag inside, placed it near the dresser, and switched on the lamp. There, he said. 2 nights, maybe 3, tops. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and handed me an envelope. $40, not because I needed it, because he wanted to feel like every variable had been accounted for. For meals, he said. I looked at the bills for a moment. The thought that crossed my mind surprised me. Not anger, not yet. Just clarity. He had prepared for my inconvenience. He had not prepared for my questions. After he left, I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the ice machine outside knock and hum every few minutes. The wall heater rattled. Somewhere farther down the walkway, a television played too loudly through a thin door. I set the envelope on the nightstand, unopened after that first look. Then I took out my phone. There were no emails from a contractor, no renovation schedule, no official notice, just 2 short text messages from Eric. On my way, all set. That was all. I read them once. Then again, short messages carry a lot of confidence when the sender assumes no one will ask for more. Around 6 o'clock, I called my neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez. She had lived across the street for more than a decade and had a talent for noticing things without sounding intrusive. I asked casually if the workers were still there. She hesitated. That hesitation was the first real signal. Workers were there earlier, she said. But Nora, I also saw a moving truck. I stared at the faded sailboat print above the dresser. A moving truck? Yes, not huge, but not contractor vans either. I thanked her and ended the call. Then I sat there quietly for a while. Outside, a semi changed gears on the highway. Someone laughed near the vending machine. A moving truck. At the time, I didn't cry. I didn't call Eric back right away. I didn't allow myself to name what I was beginning to understand. Because once you name something clearly, you have to deal with it as it actually is. Instead, I walked to the small desk in the corner, took the motel notepad, and wrote down 3 lines. Who authorized entry, what was removed, where it was taken. That was the moment I chose procedure instead of reaction. Not because I wasn't hurt, but because hurt alone doesn't hold up very well against someone who already has a plan. I called the front desk and asked if they had a printer available in the morning. Then I texted Eric. Can you send me the renovation agreement and contractor contact information tonight, please? He replied 19 minutes later, yes. Busy right now. No attachment followed. That was the first unexplained detail I kept. Not the lie. The gap. The missing document where a document should have been. And once I noticed that gap, other things began to appear. The next morning, the motel coffee tasted exactly the way motel coffee usually does. Thin, slightly bitter, hot enough to suggest freshness, even when it probably wasn't. I carried the paper cup back to the small desk in my room and opened the curtains. The gas station next door had already filled with early commuters. A man in a construction vest leaned against his truck while scrolling through his phone. Someone's radio played softly through an open car window. Ordinary life, moving along without any awareness of what had shifted inside mine. Eric still hadn't sent the renovation agreement. I checked my phone again around 8:15. Nothing. At the time, I didn't panic. I simply noticed it. Missing paperwork is rarely dramatic in the moment. It just sits there quietly where a document should be. That was the first time the situation began to feel procedural instead of personal. Around 9, I drove back toward the neighborhood, not to confront anyone, just to observe. The drive felt longer than usual. Maybe because I was paying attention to things I normally ignored. The timing of traffic lights, the sound of gravel when I pulled along the curb across from my own house. Mrs. Alvarez noticed my car almost immediately. She stepped outside with a dish towel in her hand, the way people do when they pretend they're already on their way somewhere. "Nora," she said softly, "I wasn't sure if I should call again." "What did you see?" I asked. She glanced toward my driveway. The truck came back early this morning. I followed her gaze. The driveway was empty now, except for Eric's SUV. "No workers?" I asked. She shook her head. "Just your son and that young woman Melanie, I think. His girlfriend. She had been around more often the past year. Always polite, always a little too interested in the layout of the house." "What were they moving?" I asked. "Mrs." Alvarez hesitated for a moment, then answered carefully. "Furniture mostly, dining table first. My husband's table. The walnut one he restored himself one winter in the garage." I nodded slowly. At the time, I didn't say anything else. Because when something important leaves a house, it doesn't do it quietly, even if the people moving it believe they're being careful. I could almost hear the scrape of that table across the hardwood floor in my mind. Later that day, another memory surfaced, unexpectedly. It happened while I was sitting in the motel room again, staring at the small envelope Eric had left on the nightstand. Backstory has a way of arriving in fragments like that. I remembered a Saturday afternoon 3 months earlier. Eric had been standing in my kitchen holding a real estate flyer someone left on the mailbox. "You know, houses on this street are selling for serious money now," he said. I was rinsing a coffee mug in the sink. "I'm not selling. I'm just saying the equity is there." Equity. That word again. I dried the mug slowly and placed it in the cabinet. "I like my house," I told him. Eric smiled the way people do when they think a decision hasn't fully formed yet. "Well," he said, "you never know what the future might require." At the time, I didn't think much of it. Now it sounded different. Another memory followed later that afternoon. A physical moment. Eric, kneeling beside the basement stairs during Thanksgiving, while tracing the edge of a floorboard with his finger. "You could redo all this," he said. "It works fine," I replied. He stood up and brushed dust from his hands. "Sure, but modern buyers look for updated spaces. Modern buyers, not homeowners. Buyers." Back then, I assumed he was just talking the way property managers talk. It was his professional language. But language reveals intention long before people admit it. The third memory arrived that evening. A short scene. We were standing in the front yard last fall while the maple leaves were still turning red. Eric was looking at the roofline. "You ever think about downsizing?" he asked. I laughed softly. "This house has already outlived one husband. It'll probably outlive me too." He didn't laugh. He just looked at the house a little longer than necessary. That was the moment I realized something had been building quietly for months. And suddenly, the moving truck didn't feel spontaneous anymore. It felt planned. That realization was the pressure beat that followed all those small backstory moments. Around 7 that evening, I called Lena. She worked in title processing downtown. Not a lawyer, but someone who handled property paperwork every day. The kind of person who knew where records lived and how to read them properly. I explained the situation slowly. The motel, the missing contract, the moving truck. Lena didn't interrupt until the end. Then she asked one question. "Did you sign anything recently?" "No." "Any limited authority forms? Something Eric might have asked you to initial?" I thought about that. Then I remembered. 2 months earlier, Eric had stopped by with a small stack of papers. Just a maintenance authorization, he said. In case contractors need quick approval if something breaks while I'm helping manage repairs. I had signed it near the bottom without reading every line. The way people sometimes do with family. Yes, I said quietly. Something like that. Lena was silent for a moment. That might matter, she said. How? It depends on what authority it actually grants. That was the first moment the situation shifted from observation to verification. Can you send me a picture of it? She asked. I walked to the small suitcase I brought from home and opened the side pocket where I usually kept household papers. The document was there. I photographed each page and texted them to her. It took Lena less than 3 minutes to call back. Nora, this is a limited power of attorney. The room seemed to grow very still. What does it allow? I asked. Vendor coordination, maintenance decisions. And that's all. A pause settled between us. Does it allow him to move me out of my house? I asked finally. No, Lena said calmly. It absolutely does not. I sat down slowly at the edge of the bed. The heater clicked on again. A car door slammed somewhere outside. For a few seconds, I didn't say anything. Then Lena spoke again. If he's acting outside the scope of that document, you need a lawyer. I looked down at the page in my hand. Eric's neat handwriting filled in the witness section. The authority clause sat quietly in the center of the document. Clear, limited, specific. And suddenly the shape of the problem came into focus. Eric wasn't just making decisions, he was assuming control. That realization didn't raise my voice, it lowered it. All right, I said. What are you thinking? Lena asked. I'm thinking the next step should involve someone who understands how these documents function. There was a brief pause. Then Lena said, I know someone. That was the moment procedure officially entered the situation. Not confrontation. Verification. And once verification begins, the story rarely unfolds the way the person in control expects. The following morning, I drove downtown to meet Caroline Briggs. Lena had described her in a very simple way. Calm. Careful. Doesn't waste words. That sounded like the right kind of person for the situation. Her office sat on the 4th floor of an older brick building 2 blocks from the courthouse. The hallway smelled faintly of paper and floor polish. A receptionist with silver glasses asked my name, then led me to a small conference room with a window overlooking Meridian Street. Caroline entered a few minutes later, carrying a slim folder. She shook my hand once, firmly, then sat across from me. Lena sent the document, she said. I read it last night. Her voice had the steady tone of someone used to sorting complicated things without becoming emotional about them. I slid the printed pages across the table. I didn't read every line when I signed it, I admitted. Caroline nodded. That happens often when documents involve family. She placed the pages neatly in front of her and read the central paragraph again, even though she clearly already knew it. Then she tapped the page lightly with her pen. This clause authorizes maintenance coordination, she said. That's what Lena told me. Yes. Caroline looked up at me. It does not authorize relocation of the homeowner. I felt a small breath leave my chest. And the furniture? I asked. That depends on intent, she said calmly. But removing primary household furnishings without homeowner instruction can raise questions. Questions. That word carried a kind of quiet authority. I noticed Caroline didn't say accusation. She didn't say violation. She said questions. And the house itself? I asked. The property title remains entirely in your name. That part I had expected. Still, hearing it spoken aloud in a professional voice made something inside me settle. Caroline closed the folder for a moment. Tell me what happened from the beginning, she said. So I did. The motel, the moving truck, the envelope with $40. Eric's explanation about contractors and flooring. Caroline listened without interrupting. Occasionally, she wrote a short note in the margin of a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she asked one question. Did you receive any written renovation contract? No. Any contractor contact information? No. She wrote 2 more lines on the page. Then she said something that made the entire situation feel suddenly procedural. We should confirm the actual property status. How? County records first, then any permits filed for renovation. She stood up. Come with me. Her office was only 3 blocks from the county recorder's building. We walked there together through the late morning air. The wind carried that familiar Indianapolis smell, cool pavement, traffic exhaust, and the faint sweetness of early spring. Inside the recorder's office, fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. A clerk behind the counter greeted Caroline by name. Gatekeeper. Caroline explained that we needed to verify any filings connected to my address. The clerk typed for a moment, then turned the monitor slightly toward us. No renovation permits filed, she said. Caroline nodded once. What about recent ownership filings? The clerk checked again. No transfers, no liens. Title remains unchanged. The words felt almost physical in their steadiness. Title remains unchanged. That's when the room went quiet. Not dramatically, just that subtle pause that happens when confirmation arrives exactly where it was expected. Caroline thanked the clerk, and we stepped back into the hallway. Outside the building, she stopped beside the stone steps. So, she said calmly, the documentation still reflects you as the sole owner. And Eric? Eric appears to be operating on assumption rather than authorization. I thought about that phrase. Operating on assumption. It fit the situation perfectly. What happens now? I asked. Caroline opened her folder again and reviewed the notes she had taken. First, we establish a record of removed property, she said. Then we notify any third parties currently holding those items. Like the moving company? Yes, or a storage facility. That detail made something click in my mind. Mrs. Alvarez had mentioned the moving truck returning. If furniture had left the house, it had to go somewhere. Can that be traced? I asked. Caroline gave a small, thoughtful smile. Movement of property usually leaves paperwork. That sentence carried more confidence than anything I had heard since the situation began. 2 evidence actions followed almost immediately. Caroline called the moving company logo. Mrs. Alvarez remembered from the truck. The dispatcher confirmed the job. Riverbend Storage. Then Caroline emailed a formal request for documentation, inventory list, rental agreement, storage unit assignment, evidence actions, quiet, deliberate steps. But evidence alone doesn't change a situation. Pressure does. That arrived later that afternoon. Around 4 o'clock, my phone rang. Eric. His voice carried a sharper edge than before. Mum, why is a lawyer contacting a storage company about my unit? My unit. Not our furniture. Not temporary storage. My unit. I'm verifying where my property is located, I said calmly. You didn't need a lawyer for that. I looked out the motel window at the highway traffic sliding past in long, steady lines. Apparently I did. Eric exhaled heavily. You're turning this into something it's not. What is it? I asked. A short pause. Then he said something that told me everything I needed to know about his expectations. I was just trying to manage things efficiently. Efficiently. The same word he used in the car. The same word that had quietly replaced permission with momentum. You moved me out of my own house, I said. For 2 nights. And the furniture? Temporary storage. Without asking. Another silence followed. Then Eric spoke again, his voice tighter now. You're embarrassing me. That sentence carried more emotion than anything he had said so far. Not concern. Not regret. Embarrassment. That was the moment the dynamic shifted. Because embarrassment means an audience exists. Neighbors, lawyers, storage managers, the quiet social structure around a house. And once those witnesses appear, the story no longer belongs entirely to the person who started it. Eric spoke again after a moment. You're overreacting. Possibly, I said. That's why documentation helps. He didn't answer. Eventually he said, We'll talk later, and ended the call. I stood there, with the phone still in my hand for a few seconds. Outside, a semi-truck changed gears near the highway ramp. The motel heater clicked again. Inside the structure of this situation, something had shifted. Not dramatically, but clearly. Eric believed he was managing the house. The records showed something else. And once documentation begins to move through institutions, storage facilities, county offices, legal files, the situation stops responding to confidence. It starts responding to facts. By early evening, Caroline called again. Her voice sounded calm, but there was a small note of confirmation in it. Riverbend Storage replied, she said. And? They sent the rental agreement. I waited. Eric signed it yesterday morning. That detail settled everything into a clear timeline. Moving truck, storage unit, 6-month rental. And suddenly, the renovation story no longer supported itself. Because renovation crews don't usually require homeowners to live in motels, while furniture disappears into storage for half a year, I leaned back against the small desk chair. The faded sailboat picture hung quietly above the dresser. For the first time since Eric placed that envelope on the nightstand, I felt something close to certainty. Documentation had started to move, and documentation rarely travels alone. By the next morning, the situation had separated itself into two very clear directions. One was financial, the other was social. They moved at different speeds, but they kept touching each other in small ways that made the overall picture harder and harder to ignore. Caroline called a little after 8. I had just finished the motel coffee, still thin, still bitter, and was standing by the window watching the gas station across the lot begin its morning rush. Riverbend confirmed the inventory, she said. Her tone remained as steady as ever. They've also sent a copy of the rental agreement. And? I asked. It lists Eric Bennett as the primary renter. That part didn't surprise me. What about the duration? I asked. There was a short pause. 6 months. The number settled into the room quietly. 6 months wasn't a renovation buffer. 6 months was relocation. That's when the timeline stopped supporting his explanation, Caroline said calmly. I sat down at the small desk again and looked at the notepad where I had written those 3 questions on the first night. Who authorized entry? What was removed? Where it was taken? Now one of those answers had appeared in writing. Where it was taken. Riverbend, storage, 6 months. 2 evidence actions followed within the next hour. Caroline asked the storage manager to flag the unit temporarily while ownership verification was reviewed. Then her office sent a document request asking for the full inventory list and access log. Evidence, documentation, quiet steps that move forward without raising their voice. The pressure beat came not long afterward. At 9:12, my phone rang. Eric again. His voice sounded tighter than before. Did you contact the storage facility? Yes, you're making this look like something criminal. I didn't answer immediately. Sometimes silence gives someone a moment to hear their own words. Eric, I said, finally. I'm confirming where my property is located. You know where it is. Then documentation shouldn't be a problem. Another pause. Longer this time. When he spoke again, his tone had changed slightly. You're listening to people who don't understand our situation. Strangers again. Professionals, neighbors, anyone outside the structure he had assumed would stay quiet. They're helping me understand the paperwork, I said. You don't need paperwork. You need to trust me. Trust. That word lingered for a moment. Trust works best when both people understand the same situation. Eric, I said calmly, why is the storage unit rented for 6 months? He exhaled through his teeth. That's a precaution. For what? In case the project runs longer. What project? The question stayed between us. Eventually, he said, You're twisting this. I looked down at the inventory list Caroline had emailed. Walnut dining table, 2 antique chairs, bedroom dresser, boxes labeled kitchen. No, I said. I'm reading it. Another silence. Then he shifted again, changing strategies. Mom, we needed somewhere to stay for a while. There it was, the first piece of truth. Not the whole thing, just the edge. So the renovation wasn't urgent, I said. It was efficient. That word again. Efficient. It seemed to be doing a lot of work for him lately. Your house is larger than our apartment, he continued. It made sense to use the space. Use the space. Not ask, not discuss. Use. You moved my furniture, I said. For storage. You moved me to a motel. That was temporary. For how long? Another pause. I didn't know exactly. The financial lane had now collided directly with the social one, because explanations begin to unravel once documentation appears. Around 10:30, Lena called. Her voice carried the slight echo of a busy office behind her. I heard something interesting, she said. From where? Someone in the title office mentioned your son asked a lender about refinancing options tied to your property. I sat very still. When? Last week. Before the motel. Before the moving truck. Before the renovation explanation. That detail changed the entire timeline. This wasn't spontaneous, Lena said quietly. No, I replied. It wasn't. We were both silent for a moment. Then she added something that stayed with me the rest of the day. People sometimes mistake access for ownership. I looked at the notepad again. He assumed the house was already his. Yes, I said softly. They do. Around noon, the social lane shifted again. Mrs. Alvarez called. Nora, I didn't want to interfere, she said carefully. You're not interfering. Well, your son installed a new lock this morning. A lock? A keypad one. Smart lock, I think. I closed my eyes for a moment. Access codes. Control. That meant Eric wasn't simply staying in the house. He was securing it. Operational control can create the illusion of ownership very quickly, but property law tends to see things differently. By early afternoon, the financial lane tightened further. Riverbend Storage sent the inventory log. The document listed each item carefully. Walnut dining table, 2 antique chairs, bedroom dresser, kitchen bins. But the line that caught Caroline's attention appeared near the top. Property classification. Owner vacated furnishings. Owner vacated. Not temporarily stored. Vacated. That's when everything shifted. Because words in documents carry weight. More weight than explanations spoken in a hallway. Caroline called again around 2. The storage manager has flagged the unit, she said. No items can be removed until ownership verification is complete. Procedure. Quiet. Effective. Almost immediately afterward, the social lane moved again. Mrs. Alvarez called back. Nora, a courier came to the house. A courier? Yes. Your son looked upset when he opened the envelope. That would have been Caroline's notice. Formal language tends to cool situations very quickly. I imagined Eric standing in my hallway reading the same type of careful wording Caroline used in her office. Words that turn assumptions into questions. Words that slow momentum. Later that afternoon, Eric called again, but this time his tone had changed. Not confidence, not irritation, something closer to negotiation. Mom, he said, we should talk in person. That might be helpful, I replied. When? Tomorrow morning. Where? At the house. I thought about that for a moment. Meeting at the house meant he still believed the space belonged under his control. All right, I said, but my attorney will attend. A long pause followed. Finally, he said, fine. The word sounded smaller than it had before. After we hung up, I sat quietly near the motel window. Cars moved steadily along. Route 41. Someone laughed outside near the vending machines. Ordinary sounds. But inside the structure of this situation, something fundamental had shifted. Eric's tone had moved from confidence to irritation to negotiation. Institutional pressure does that. It replaces assumption with documentation. And documentation rarely moves in anyone's favor once the questions begin. Tomorrow morning we would meet at the house Eric believed he controlled, the house that still carried my name on every official record. And tomorrow something very simple would become visible. You can move furniture, you can install locks, you can even live inside a house, but ownership doesn't move that easily. The next morning arrived colder than the previous ones. Late March in Indiana does that sometimes. One day you feel the first hint of spring, and the next morning the air reminds you winter hasn't quite finished with you yet. I left the motel a little after 8. The parking lot still held thin streaks of frost in the shaded spots. The gas station next door had just opened its doors, and a delivery driver leaned against his truck, drinking coffee from a foam cup. Ordinary morning things. Caroline met me 2 blocks from my house so we could arrive together. She drove a grey sedan that looked exactly like something an attorney would choose. Clean, practical, almost invisible in traffic. When I got in, she handed me a printed copy of the latest message Eric had sent overnight. His wording had changed. Short sentences, careful tone. I acted under the assumption of homeowner benefit. Assumption again. Caroline tapped the line lightly with her pen. Assumptions are not enforceable, she said. Neither of us spoke much during the rest of the drive. The streets in my neighborhood looked exactly as they always had. Mailboxes with small red flags, trim hedges, a child's scooter tipped on its side near the curb, 2 houses down. Familiar scenes that didn't seem aware they were about to host something uncomfortable. When we turned onto my street, Mrs. Alvarez was already standing near her front window pretending to adjust the blinds. She waved once when she saw my car. Witness. Eric's SUV sat in the driveway. Melanie's car was parked behind it. The new smart lock was visible from the sidewalk, a black keypad against the white trim of my front door. It looked slightly out of place, like a watch someone had borrowed and forgotten to return. Caroline and I walked up the path together. Near the porch steps, the tulips I planted last fall had begun pushing small green shoots through the soil. Spring has a way of arriving quietly. The front door opened before we knocked. Eric stood there. He looked tired. Not disorganized. Eric never allowed himself to appear careless, but the confidence he carried 3 days earlier had softened into something more cautious. "Mum," he said. Then he looked at Caroline. "You must be the attorney." "Caroline Briggs," she replied calmly. Eric stepped aside. Inside, the house smelled faintly of coffee and lemon cleaner. Melanie stood near the kitchen doorway with her arms folded. Her expression carried that careful politeness people use when they know others are watching. "Good morning, Nora," she said. "Melanie." Eric motioned toward the dining table. "My dining table, technically, though the chairs were missing." "Let's sit," he said. Caroline placed her folder neatly on the table and took the seat beside me. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then Eric cleared his throat. "This has gotten unnecessarily complicated." Caroline didn't respond immediately. Silence can be useful in situations like this. Finally, Eric continued. "I was trying to make things easier for Mom." Caroline opened the folder slowly and slid the inventory list across the table. The documentation suggests something different. Eric glanced at the page but didn't pick it up. "That's just paperwork." "And," The 6-month storage agreement? Caroline asked. Eric leaned back slightly. That was precautionary. For a renovation with no filed permit, she said calmly. Another quiet moment passed. Performance had reached its limit. Eric leaned forward. Look, he said, we needed a place to stay for a couple of months. Our lease ended sooner than expected. There it was. Finally spoken plainly. Melanie shifted slightly in the doorway but didn't interrupt. So you moved into my house, I said, temporarily, and moved my belongings for storage, and relocated me to a motel. That wasn't meant to be long-term. My voice remained calm, not because the situation didn't hurt, but because the structure had become clear. The paperwork already had my name on it. Title, tax record, insurance file. Control can move quickly. Ownership rarely does. Eric rubbed the back of his neck. You're making this sound worse than it is. Caroline spoke again. The issue isn't how it sounds, she said. It's how it functions. Eric looked at her. What does that mean? It means the limited power of attorney allows vendor coordination. It does not authorize relocation of the homeowner or occupancy changes. Melanie spoke for the first time. We thought it did. Caroline nodded once. That belief doesn't expand the scope of the document. Another pause followed, not tense this time. More like the moment when everyone in a room understands the direction things are moving. Eric looked down at the table. So what happens now? Caroline closed the folder. Now the structure returns to its original configuration. Eric frowned slightly. What does that mean? It means the homeowner resumes full control of the residence. Eric looked around the room. For the first time, he seemed to notice the details. The kitchen counter, the hallway, the living room window. What about us? He asked quietly. That question hung in the air for a moment. I answered it myself. You'll need to find another place to stay, Melanie inhaled sharply. Eric didn't argue. He just sat there staring at the wood grain of the table. Finally, he said something very soft. I thought it would work. That sentence carried more honesty than anything else he had said that week, because it revealed the real calculation behind everything. Momentum, access, assumption. Some people mistake silence for permission. I stood slowly and walked toward the doorway. Outside, the tulip shoots caught my eye again. Spring doesn't arrive because someone declares it. It arrives because the ground eventually returns to its own pattern. Before leaving, I turned back once. There was one sentence left to say. You can't take what was never yours. The words settled into the room quietly. Not like a threat, more like a correction. Outside, Mrs. Alvarez was watering the flower bed near her porch. She looked up and gave me a small nod. Witness again. By late afternoon, Eric and Melanie had packed their things. The smart lock was removed. My furniture began returning from storage the following day. The walnut dining table came back first. I ran my hand across the surface, the way my husband used to, and noticed the same slight unevenness in the left leg. Some things don't change. Life gradually returned to its familiar rhythm. Mail in the morning, tea near the window in the evening. Occasional phone calls from Eric that sounded more careful than before. Repairing relationships takes longer than correcting paperwork. But structures matter. And sometimes structures teach people what conversations cannot. A few weeks later, Lena stopped by with a small potted plant. She said was impossible to kill. We placed it near the kitchen window. If stories about quiet boundaries resonate with you, you're welcome to stay. Because sometimes the most important lessons arrive without raised voices. They arrive in the calm moment when someone finally realizes the difference between access and ownership. And once that difference becomes clear, things tend to settle back into their proper places.